Brunson pulled off yet another remarkable first-round knockout on Saturday when in the UFC Fight Night 119 headliner, he became the fastest to ever defeat former UFC champion Lyoto Machida. Brunson, 185 MMA, 93 UFC, used his dangerous left hand to set up a quick finish of Machida, 228 MMA, 148 UFC in the FS1 televised middleweight headliner at Ibirapuera Gymnasium in Sao Paulo. Prelims aired on FS2 and UFC Fight Pass. As a result, the one is becoming a fixture in the UFC 185-pound record books. The UFC's sixth stop in Sao Paulo saw Brazilian fighters win 9 of 12 bouts. For more on the numbers behind the card, check below for 55 post-event facts about UFC Fight Night 119. General Brazilian fighters fell to 37 main event fights on home soil dating back to December 2014. The Reebok athlete outfitting payout for the event totaled $170,000. Debuting fighters went 10 at the event. Brunson, Pedro Munhoz, Elizeu Zaleski dos Santos and Max Griffin earned $50,000 UFC Fight Night 119 Fight Night bonuses. UFC Fight Night 119 drew an announced attendance of 10,265. No live gate was disclosed for the event. Betting favorites went 83 on the card. One fight had even odds. Total fight time for the 12-bout card was 15,718. Main card: Brunson's 9 UFC victories since 2012 in middleweight competition are tied with Brad Tavares for most in the division. Brunson has earned 7 of his 9 UFC victories by stoppage. Brunson's 7 UFC stoppage victories since 2012 in middleweight competition are tied for most in the division. Brunson's 7 first-round stoppage victories in UFC middleweight competition are most in divisional history. Machida fell to 57 in UFC main event fights. Machida's 3-fight losing skid is the longest of his career. He hasn't earned a victory since December 2014. Machida fell to 34 since he dropped to the UFC middleweight division in October 2013. Machida has suffered 3 of his 4 UFC middleweight losses by stoppage. Colby Covington's 131 MMA, 81 UFC 5-fight UFC winning streak in welterweight competition is the second longest active streak in the division behind Kamaru Usman's 6. Covington attempted no takedowns in a fight for the first time in his UFC career. He landed 41 takedowns combined in his previous 8 UFC appearances. Demian Maia, 258 MMA, 198 UFC, fell to 104 since he dropped to the UFC welterweight division in July 2012. Maia is a combined 0 for 35 on takedown attempts over his past 2 UFC appearances. Maia has suffered 7 of his 8 UFC losses by decision. Pedro Munhoz and Rob Font. Munhoz 152 MMA, 52 UFC 4-fight UFC winning streak in bantamweight competition is the third longest active streak in the division behind champ Cody Garbrandt 5 and Jimmy Rivera 5. Munhoz has earned 4 of his 5 UFC victories by stoppage. Munhoz's 3 submission victories in UFC bantamweight competition are tied for second most in divisional history behind Uriah Faber 6. Rob Font, 143 MMA, 42 UFC, suffered the first submission loss of his career. Francisco Trinaldo's 225 MMA, 124 UFC, 11 victories since 2011 in UFC lightweight competition are tied with Donald Cerrone for most in the division. Trinaldo has earned 7 of his past 9 victories by decision. Jim Miller, 2,811 MMA, 1710 UFC 3-fight losing skid is the longest of his career. He hasn't earned a victory since November 2016. Miller fell to 47 in his past 11 UFC appearances. Miller's total fight time of 45,753 in UFC lightweight competition is most in divisional history. Miller has suffered 8 of his 11 career losses by decision. Thiago Moreta Santos, 165 MMA, 84 UFC, has earned 7 of his 8 UFC victories by knockout. Santos' 7 knockout victories in UFC middleweight fights are tied with champ Michael Bisping and Chris Leben for second most in divisional history behind Anderson Silva 8. Thiago Moreta Santos' 7 knockouts since 2014 in UFC competition are tied for second most in the company behind Derek Lewis 8. Jack Hermansson, 164 MMA, 32 UFC, suffered the first knockout loss of his career. John Lineker, 308 MMA, 113 UFC, improved to 51 since he moved up to the UFC bantamweight division in September 2015. Marlon Vera 1041 MMA, 43 UFC has suffered all 4 of his career losses by decision. Preliminary card Vicente Luque 1261 MMA, 52 UFC has earned 11 of his 12 career victories by stoppage. That includes all 5 of his UFC wins. Luque 5 stoppage victories since 2015 in UFC competition are tied for second most in the company behind Lewis 6. Luque 2 Darce choke victories in UFC competition are tied with Dustin Poirier for second most in company history behind Tony Ferguson 3. Nico Price 101 MMA, 21 UFC had his 11-fight unbeaten streak snapped for the first defeat of his career. Antonio Carlos Jr. 92 MMA, 62 UFC improved to 51 with 1 no contest since he dropped to the UFC middleweight division in June 2015. Carlos Jr.'s 4-fight UFC winning streak in middleweight competition is the third longest active streak in the division behind Robert Whittaker 7 and Bisping 5. Carlos Jr. has earned all of his career stoppage victories by submission. Jack Marshman 227 MMA, 22 UFC suffered the first submission loss of his career. Hakron Diaz 2361 MMA, 35 UFC 3-fight losing skid is the longest of his career. He hasn't earned a victory since June 2015. Diaz has suffered all 6 of his career losses by decision. Elizeu Zaleski dos Santos 185 MMA, 41 UFC 4-fight UFC winning streak in welterweight competition is tied for the third longest active streak in the division behind Kamaru Usman 6 and Covington 5. Dos Santos has earned 3 of his 4 UFC victories by decision. Griffin 134 MMA, 12 UFC has suffered 3 of his 4 career losses by decision. Davison Figueiredo 130 MMA, 20 UFC earned just the second decision victory of his career and first since May 1, 2014, a span of 1,276 days, more than 3 years and 9 fights. Jared Brooks 131 MMA, 11 UFC had his 13-fight winning streak snapped for the first defeat of his career. Marcelo Gomes 50 MMA, 10 UFC has earned all of his career victories by stoppage. Gomes earned the first submission victory of his career. Christian Colombo 831 MMA, 021 UFC has suffered all 3 of his career losses by submission. For complete coverage of UFC Fight Night 119, check out the UFC events section of the site. Fight metric research analyst and live statistics producer Michael Carroll contributed to this story. Follow him on Twitter at @MuFlipDascript.